The first reason AIDS is out of control among African Americans is ignorance. Ignorance among people in power. Ignorance among people who should know better. Take a look at this. In October 2004, when Vice President Dick Cheney and Democratic challenger John Edwards took the stage to debate, moderator Gwen Eiffel asked them this question.
Mr. Vice President, in particular, I want to talk to you about AIDS, and not about AIDS in China or Africa, but AIDS right here in this country, where black women between the ages of 25 and 44 are 13 times more likely to die of the disease than their counterparts. What should the government's role be?
When you asked it of the Vice President, what were you expecting?
You know, I really was expecting that he'd have an answer. I was expecting that both of them would say this is something we must address, and in my administration, we will.
Well, this is a great tragedy, Gwen, when you think about the enormous cost here in the United States and around the world of the AIDS epidemic. I had not heard those numbers with respect to African-American women. I was not aware that it was that severe an epidemic there.
I was surprised and frustrated because of the constraints of the debate. I couldn't say, what? I couldn't say, how can that be, Mr. Vice President? And I was equally surprised that the Democrat had no answer. Senator Edwards, you have 90 seconds.
Yes, well, first, with respect to what's happening in Africa and Russia and other places around the world.
Senator Edwards didn't seem to know much about the epidemic in Black America either.
The AIDS epidemic in Africa, which is killing millions and millions of people.
What kind of reaction did you get afterwards?
The reaction I got from folks in the black community who said, what does this mean? Don't they care about us?
The fact that you asked about AIDS in America and they answered about Africa is almost proof of just how invisible the issue is.
Well, a lot of Americans are of the opinion that the problem is solved, that it's not an issue to talk about domestically anymore.
Live from Cape Town, South Africa.
But it's not just white leaders who talk a lot more about AIDS in Africa than at home.
Do y'all over there know him?
Many Black American leaders and celebrities have gone off to fight the disease a continent away.
Wear a condom and protect yourself.
It's just easier because they can go and take a vacation, see the giraffes and the zebras. You know, I can go in the village and I can touch the people and I can have my emotional moment and I can get on my plane and I could fly back home and said I addressed HIV/AIDS and therefore I don't have to do anymore.
And what has happened with the globalization of the AIDS fight is that it has been a false choice because we have to deal with all of it. And what kind of credibility can we have when we go to sub-Saharan Africa or Eastern Europe or Asia when we can't even solve the problem with folks who we see and work with every single day?
Last year, the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta announced that for the first time, more than 1 million Americans are infected with HIV. Almost half of them are Black.
As a scientist, you've been working on HIV/AIDS from just about the beginning.
Yes.
Almost a quarter century.
Right.
Did you see this coming in the Black American community?
Yes. You could see it coming. All you have to do is just sit down and think about it in pure, cold, infectious disease terms. It's a infectious disease that's transmitted by sexual contact, both homosexual sex, men who have sex with men, heterosexual contact, and injection drug use. So the handwriting was on the wall for quite a long time.
If the government's most important AIDS scientists could see this crisis coming so clearly, why has there been no government policy or program aimed specifically at stopping the epidemic in Black America? In fact, some government policies have made the problem worse. And that brings us to the second reason the African American epidemic has gotten out of control: government failure. AIDS first took hold in the Black community 25 years ago, in the inner cities, among addicts shooting intravenous drugs.
The first time I did it, somebody kept telling me, you should try, you'll like it. And he put the drugs in me. Now I'm 17 years old when he did this to me.
Addicts sharing needles with other addicts spread the disease fast before anyone really understood that this was a way to get infected.
My mother, she passed away from HIV.
Sad as it seems, though,
Then in the 1980s came the war on drugs, new state and federal laws that unintentionally sent the epidemic into overdrive. The war on drugs meant sending thousands more street-level drug offenders to prison, men who were more likely to be infected with HIV from dirty needles. Since 1980, the U.S. prison population has quadrupled.
We're doing mass incarcerations of black men in America. More college-age black men are in prison than are in college. Many of them go into prison HIV negative, come out HIV positive, and we don't have a strategy to deal with this.
Prisons are notorious breeding grounds for HIV. Infection rates are 5 times higher than outside the walls. Sex between men in prison has been the subject of only a handful of studies, but one study by a national police organization found that at least 40% of inmates had had sex with another man in prison. And despite strong evidence that condoms reduce the spread of AIDS, they are forbidden in all federal and most state and local prisons.
To make condoms available in prison would be to admit that sex occurs in prison. And for some reason, the prisons don't want to say that happens. But if we want to encourage HIV transmission, it's the perfect policy. I think that would be the way to do it.
In most prisons, testing is voluntary. AIDS activists say that's because if an inmate tests positive, he has a right to treatment, and the prisons don't want to pay the high cost. So men can leave prison infected with HIV and never know it. And most men say when they leave prison, they'll resume having sex with women.
Well, I have looked at rates of incarceration throughout the state of North Carolina, 100 counties. And in those counties where the rates are highest, the rates of sexually transmitted diseases and HIV are also highest. So there is a relationship, a direct relationship between these two. All of this is the perfect storm for HIV. All of it comes together to create a situation where HIV could hardly be better off.
Back on the streets, any serious attempts by government to bring the epidemic in Black America under control have been haphazard and underfunded. There is one approach that has proven successful in other countries: needle exchange. In a few American cities like Baltimore, AIDS activists started needle exchange programs where addicts could trade in dirty needles for clean ones.
All right, that's 6. Drop that 6 in the show.
But in 1989, Congress banned the use of federal money to pay for these programs. And without federal funds, needle exchange has never been widely adopted. At first, many black leaders agreed with the ban on funding needle exchange, fearing it would encourage the use of drugs. But by the mid-1990s, most black leaders had changed their minds. And President Clinton seriously explored the possibility of federal funding if the scientific evidence was clear and convincing.
So we very carefully went over all of the data and came to the overwhelming conclusion: A, injection drug use does not get increased, and B, needle exchange helps prevent HIV infection.
No free needles. Help the addicts get off drugs. Don't help the addicts have clean needles.
Conservative opposition was unrelenting. And at that very moment, Clinton was overwhelmed by a crisis of his own making, so he had almost no political clout. He told his top officials to hold off on needle exchange.
I didn't know what hold off meant, but I just got a cold, big pot of water thrown on me because I thought it was going to happen, and it didn't.
Today, this president continues to oppose federal funding for needle exchange, even though the co-chairman of his own advisory council on AIDS favors it.
So you would support needle exchange program?
Now that we have the data, yes.
President Bush doesn't.
Well, he's the president and I'm not. So.
But he's wrong in your judgment.
Well, I would leave it there. He's the president and I'm not. I think this is a program that really should be seriously looked at, because if it saves lives, it really is important.
The failure to fund needle exchange or any effective alternative is just one example of what the government could have done, but did not. Meanwhile, dirty needles still account for almost a third of all AIDS cases in Black America.